You are rolling.
All right, so go ahead and introduce yourself.
Okay. Hi, I'm Michelle Lyon. I'm a 7th grade English teacher at Scullin Middle School. Yesterday I taught a lesson.
You can pick it up from
Yeah,
the top.
I'm horrible at this.
No worries.
So I'm supposed to be saying,
Just go ahead. Just tell me what you teach. You don't have to tell us what lesson that you taught.
Okay,
but
cool.
I teach English, or 5th period, or what specifically. What is it? What class?
it's English language arts.
Okay, just tell me that.
Okay.
So
Do you want me to
again,
start over?
yeah, no worries.
All right.
Okay, so just take it from the top.
All right.
Go ahead
Hi.
and introduce yourself.
I'm Michelle Lyon. I teach 7th grade English language arts at Scullin Middle School.
Okay, great. Okay, so going into the questions, they say, we want to understand the decisions you made in planning for this lesson and how it fits into the unit and year. So first question, how does this lesson connect to and build on students' prior skills and knowledge? What was taught before this lesson and what will come after it?
This lesson relates to a unit that we're doing in our English language arts curriculum. It's the acceptance and rejection unit. We have essential questions where the students are looking at their own acceptance, like their own, oh my God. Sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah. The students are looking at their own role and their own acceptance and what part they take in the acceptance of others. Prior to this lesson, we read a poem by E.E. Cummings called Old Age Sticks. We've been looking at different concepts that different ways that people are accepted or rejected in society. We started looking at something we thought that the students would be familiar with, looking at sort of like a generation gap, like old and young. And as the unit progresses, we will look at different ways that people are accepted or rejected, like through racial stereotypes, and we'll look at different like socioeconomic status and things like that, so the kids start to build this like greater understanding of the importance of this topic as it relates to our whole unit.
Good, great. Discuss the sequence of lessons that surround this one lesson.
This is a pretty beginning type of lesson because we just started the unit a week ago. So we really just started with the kids kind of defining what they thought acceptance meant in their own lives. And the kids are really great about being able to think of personal examples. Like being in middle school, I think it's a very appropriate topic. They were able to think of things like the lunchroom, and when you go to sit down and other people don't accept you to be part of that group or something like that. And then this particular lesson, the only thing we had done prior to this was kind of looked at a poem, like the E.E. Cummings poem, and then we're also reading a book about Temple Grandin, which we've read just a few chapters of, talking about autism, and the students were able to kind of connect with people that they know, and some of them, even students that have some learning disabilities themselves, were able to kind of connect with this and understand what it means, like when other people are viewing you as different, and some of the strategies that you need to put into place hold on, I lost my train of thought.
Strategies they're putting into place.
Yeah, sort of like the strategies that they need to put into place, like if they want to be accepted, and what are some things that they can do when people are kind of just not accepting them for who they are.
Good, you're doing good. All right, second question. Is the text used in this lesson part of a sequence of text designed to build skills and knowledge?
The text that we used for this lesson came from a psychology, like personnel journal. It isn't one that's part of the actual curriculum. The way our curriculum is written is that we have like anchor texts and like text sets, but teachers have the freedom and opportunity to pull in like informational articles that they find that are current and relevant. I saw this particular text when I was looking through some information online, and I thought it fit with the unit perfectly. It's important to pair texts and bring in as much informational text as you can. And I think a lot of times it's hard for teachers to think like how you do that. And even the idea of like pairing like with a piece of poetry, just taking that concept of old versus young, you can find something that's currently happening in the world and pull that in. So, the text itself actually talked about this generation gap that's happening in the workforce currently right now and some of the problems associated with that. So I think it was kind of helpful to bring that in to get that real world perspective for the kids to kind of, grapple with a little bit.
So the second part of this is, please give an example of other texts that form this sequence.
Oh, like the other text that we'll be using, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Whatever,
Yeah.
however it translates to you.
All right. So like we start, pretty simple. We will, like I said, we looked at the poem. Then we pulled in this informational piece. The students will be doing a little bit of research soon, like directly after this, where they will look up a person or investigate a person that was kind of a social outcast, maybe not, fully accepted. So they might look at some people like Albert Einstein or, Rosa Parks or different like famous people that really maybe didn't fit like the mold of society, but they had great things to share. And, some of these people were fine with not being accepted and still went ahead and did great things. Other people kind of worked to get their point across and get their message across to everyone else by trying different strategies to fit in or make people understand them, which relates to our essential questions in the unit. So it kind of gives the kids like a better understanding of that. And then we read a lot of different short stories that relate to this. We'll read All Summers in a Day by Ray Bradbury, where the students will look at a girl that's kind of isolated for being different, and then how people feel after they isolate someone. And we'll read more informational texts from like current events and newspaper sources and things like that.
Good. Talk about the standards targeted in this lesson. What did you do to make the lesson reflect the full intent of the standard?
A big standard that, do we need to know the number?
Specifically?
Yeah, like the number.
Some people do list them,
right.
But again, whatever's comfortable for you.
Okay.
You don't have to go, W7-1B. You don't want to go into that much depth, but
all right.
Some really do. They list it off their notes,
all right.
Or they just kind of combine everything together.
I'll just okay, cool. So the question was, say that again.
I'll read it again.
Thanks.
So talk about the standards targeted in this lesson. What did you do to make the lesson reflect the full intent of that standard?
All right. One of the most important things, I think, when you're looking at Common Core, there's a big push for always having evidence behind your thinking. That's something at 7th grade that we really try to hit home with in our curriculum. Always, making sure that whatever you say is supported with something that's actually grounded in a text we're reading and things like that. And I think throughout my lesson, you can see that whether we're looking at a painting, a poem, or a media clip, we are always thinking of the different ways, like how do you, when you're forming an opinion, or you have a claim, how are you supporting that? So I would constantly, through questioning, text-dependent questions and things like that, have my students going back to the text, like pulling a line, for example, from the poem to support your thought about what is the author particularly saying, what's the message, what's the point that the author is trying to get across, and being able to support that. And I think it's harder when you're looking at a visual piece because the text isn't like right there physically for you, like words that the kids can pull from. So when they have to kind of explain what they've just seen or what they perceive in a piece of art, I think that's a different skill. But I think it's important with all the different varieties of text that we can see today.
Which of the core action indicators do you think this lesson best exemplifies and why?
Core action indicator. I'm still confused with the core action indicators. We said that those might be like the shifts, but you said people talked about like collaboration and everything too. Like, I know.
I mean, if you can try it, and if you want to skip it, that's fine too.
All right.
But again, I don't know exactly what they're looking for.
Okay. I think this lesson really exemplifies the importance of working together collaboratively. The students have to do a little bit of thinking on their own throughout each of these pieces. Like I always have the kids stop for a moment, and if I show them something and I have a guiding question, I like them to process it on their own, but then I also like for them to be able to, in a group, share their thinking and also be able to work together and kind of build off of each other's ideas. I think also being able to look at a hard piece of text, like the text that we were using for this particular lesson, it's a pretty high Lexile level. The text complexity was hard, being that it was from a journal, an adult type journal, but the kids really had to work together to kind of sort through that, monitor their comprehension, and kind of help each other out with that. And I do have a lot of students with like IEPs, a lot of special education students, and I didn't, change that text for them. They were still in the same text. I did modify some of the questions so they were a little more like guiding for them. But I think they did a really wonderful job with each other and with my support staff that was in my classroom to be able to kind of build off of each other a little bit.
So the next set of questions, we're interested in how the shifts required by the CCSS are being incorporated into your instruction. Discuss how this lesson illustrates the shifts required by the CCSS.
Okay. Well, shift one of the Common Core standards is to, build knowledge through content-rich informational literature. I think that looking at a real-world article like this, where you're looking at an issue that impacts a lot of these students, like as they get older, maybe some of their parents right now, looking at that age gap, and making sure that the text also is at a challenging level. So it's not too easy for the students. They have to experience a little bit of like frustration as they're going through it, which is a great part of the learning process. And through being asked to go back to the text and, support their thinking and the claims that they make, I think that is giving them a lot of access to this type of material. One of the girls during the lesson, I thought it was interesting, she actually made a connection and told me like one of her, mother's friends actually felt like she got discriminated against, like for working like in a clothing store and getting kind of like the employers giving her a hard time because of her age, and felt like that was a form of age discrimination. So I think when you're reading something challenging like that, and then the kids are able to take something away from it, transfer that knowledge to a real life situation, I think that's really important. The lesson had a lot of reading in it. We looked, I think, at like 4 different types of texts throughout. Kids were constantly comparing texts. They had to write throughout the unit, they had to write throughout the entire lesson. Like I would ask them to do thinking through talking, collaborating, as well as written, to kind of synthesize all the different concepts a little bit more. And I think that also the third shift relating to giving access and to all students access to the same text is important. I talked a little bit about how a lot of my students in my classroom need that extra support. I have students that are quite a few, 3 or 4 maybe grade levels, lower reading level than some of the other students. So there's quite a bit of diversity and a lot of different levels within the classroom. So as a teacher, you kind of have to scaffold that instruction and make sure that everyone has access to it, and to also be constantly going back to the Tier 2 vocabulary. I try to not just, give the kids like the student-friendly definitions and memorize them, but apply them throughout the entire process. I would go back to, like we were looking at the words debase and precept, and so in my conversation and in the conversations the students had as well, I would ask them to kind of make sure they were using those naturally so they could see the application of that.
Okay, great. Second part of that question, how did you teach the content of this lesson or this text prior to the CCSS? What is the same and what's different?
I think prior to this, like I would have been hesitant to introduce so many different like texts so fast, like in one lesson. Like I think I would have spent maybe a few days looking at maybe one text and kind of covering like everything about it. With the new Common Core standards and sort of the way you approach it, we have our essential questions, like our main focus of what we are looking at, and we always keep going back to that. So if I'm looking at a poem, I don't need to do every single thing with the poem. Like I don't need to analyze the symbolism and have the kids, you know, write their own poem that matches it and things like that. I can kind of quickly show that and have my kids do something related to our essential question. Like, okay, what lines in this poem are kind of emphasizing or illustrating the conflict that we're talking about between like the old and young, and then show it.
Sixth grade, social studies meeting will be in B208.
You're doing great.
Okay,
It's
thanks.
flowing.
Okay. Where do you want me to pick up at? Just where I was?
Yeah, so you were talking about the old and young.
Oh, yeah. So like if we were looking at a poem and you are, you know, taking a line to express the conflict between old and young, then I can quickly move to like a, you know, 2-minute clip and have them take that same idea. Now, what can you pull from this? Or go to a picture and what can you get from this? And I think all of that, the pairing of the texts and putting all of that together kind of helps build a better understanding than if I would have spent, you know, 2 days on like one story doing everything with it. So it's more of a, I think there's more of a purpose. And we are going like really deep with all of these different texts that we have.
Okay. So next set of questions. Student engagement is crucial to the work of the CCSS. We want to understand how you ensured that all students had the opportunity to productively engage in the work of the lessons. How did you support all the students in working with grade level texts? For example, how did you provide scaffolding for students below grade level so they can read grade level text?
I think student engagement is really essential. Shifting to Common Core this year and working with students, I noticed that because we're bringing in these texts that are content rich and, you know, interesting, the kids are more motivated to be engaged. I know that the kids today are a lot different than like when I was in school. They're used to seeing a lot of things like online and a lot of images and messages, and they have different ways of reading, and they're interested a lot of times in a lot of the visual types of things. So, you know, incorporating a picture that they find very interesting or a media clip, they really can read that and are kind of used to that sort of format. So I think it's good to like help students begin to critically analyze some of those pieces and can you read that just like you would read like a poem or a short story or something like that. So I felt like the students were pretty engaged. You know, they were really excited to see the painting that I used because there were like hidden images in it, so they were really interested in that and how it related. You know, I had mentioned I have a lot of students with special needs in my classroom, so you have to take that into consideration. I have a few students with autism, so I have to kind of keep my eye on if they're getting like, you know, stressed out or overstimulated. Sometimes just the very factor of having like a lot of conversations going on in a classroom can be too much. I know at one point one of my students was feeling very, you know, overwhelmed. So the support teacher was real close by him, and then I came in and sat by him at one point and just kind of reassured him that it was okay, and if he needed to take a break or something, it was fine. To the content, I'm really think it's important to give students that are a little bit below grade level the same access to text that everyone else is reading. In the past, you might give a student like a summarized version of a text or something a little bit easier, but they're not really then practicing the same skills that everyone else is practicing. And those students that maybe are a little bit lower need that opportunity to be able to kind of struggle through that same material and have that same rich experience as everyone else. So instead of changing up the material, we work really hard, myself and the various support teachers that were in my classroom, scaffolding our own instruction, providing questions that might be a little bit more leading. On the handout that the students had, there were kind of like multiple choice for like the key idea, like when the students were trying to determine the key idea. On the modified version, instead of having the students have to go through the physical process of actually writing it out and come to it on their own, we developed a series of multiple choice questions that would list some that are kind of similar and have them, can they identify it there? So it kind of took out that hard part of the writing for some of the students and gave them an opportunity to look at it and see if they could determine that, and as a teacher, when I'm assessing that, I can see by what they select if they're truly comprehending the article, and are they able to select from a series of things what the key idea is. I'm not in that moment assessing their writing skills, so kind of knowing what you're looking for from the students and being able to figure that out as a teacher and give them the support in the moment that they need, and just kind of keeping an eye on that.
How do you provide opportunities for the students who are advanced to engage more deeply with grade level or above grade level text?
I always try to give choice within the different activities that I create. The activity that I had yesterday, there were sort of like leveled choices that the students could pick, kind of comparing different texts. One was a little more, I would say, challenging than the other, and some of my higher level students naturally picked that one where they had to go back to we have an anchor text that we use, and so they had to kind of pull out that old poem that we used and be able to compare it to a couple of the concepts we discussed in the lesson. So I think sometimes providing that natural choice. Sometimes I might have like extra questions or just like a little challenge activity that if I notice like a group is finishing before another group, I can kind of go over to that group and, ask them to like think a little bit more about this, or, why don't you consider this, as I'm walking around the room, just natural questioning to the students, kind of like pushing them to that level. And I think as a teacher, you have to know where your kids are at. And you also don't want it to seem like, oh, you're just giving the smart kids in class like a bunch of extra work to do. But I think if it's a natural conversation, it doesn't feel like obtrusive, and the students are more susceptible to just kind of take on that challenge in that moment, and it gives them something to think about.
Okay. Let's see. How do you know the students were able to successfully respond to the text-dependent questions and tasks with precision?
I spend a lot of time when the students are working in groups. I like to have my students doing as much of the work as possible. I don't like to be in front of the classroom like lecturing for 90 minutes. That's no fun for anybody. So my students are always working or actively engaged in something. So when I'm walking around the classroom, and I was doing that yesterday, I was like, I was reading some of their responses as they were going, and if I noticed the students were maybe not quite getting, pulling that evidence, for example, the way I wanted to, I would rephrase the question, or I'd say, oh, why don't you try to go back and add a little bit more to that? Or, one of the questions was about how do you know this is credible, this source is credible, and the students actually were just writing down, it has facts and statistics. And we had the conversation of, can I just say you should believe me because I have facts and statistics? And they're like, well, no. And so they're like, well, you have to say what they are. And then I was like, well, yeah, you need to do that too. So then when I gave that feedback or that redirection, the students were then able to go back into the text and pull a specific line or something that would give it more credibility. So having those questions and knowing what your purpose is, I was really focusing on, can you pull evidence to support what you're thinking? And then kind of walking around monitoring, it kind of helps you know as a teacher where the kids are at. And I typically always have a written handout or something that I can collect from the kids, which the one that they're working on, I can collect and kind of read over their responses and see if they're on track and things like that.
Okay. Second part of the question. Did students acquire the literary skills addressed in this lesson? Second part to that, what did you do for students who did not acquire the literary skills addressed in the lesson? So again, did students acquire the literary skills addressed in the lesson?
That's weird. That's worded weird. I feel like the students did achieve the literary skills. Well, hold on. That doesn't. Did they? Can you say the question again? I'm sorry.
Did students acquire the literacy skills addressed in the lesson? What did you do for the students who did not acquire the literary skills addressed in the lesson?
Okay. I feel as a whole that my students did, after getting some redirection in some cases, I feel like they were able to pull evidence and support what they were saying. I do believe that they were able to comprehend the connection between the different pieces of literature that were used. They were able to see how it fit with the unit and make that connection themselves. As I was walking around and I noticed some students weren't fully doing that, I was able to guide them. I know one of my groups that a support teacher was working with, they started off and they were okay, but I noticed they weren't annotating their text, and when I went and sat with them and asked them what they thought like the key idea of the pieces were, they weren't able to really articulate what that was. So we went back and we reread and then went through and then highlighted and picked out like the important details, and then they were able to go ahead and communicate what they thought was important about that piece. So I think eventually the students got where I wanted them to. This is a very early lesson in this particular unit, so the skill is going to build, obviously, and it's something that's a year-long skill that we're working on. So I think that for this particular lesson, early on, they were where I wanted them to be.
Okay, last portion of the question.
Good.
Or actually, no, there's a few more still on the list. Which behaviors from Core Action 3 did the students best exemplify in this lesson?
I didn't answer that one already. I thought I answered that one already.
No, they talked about the shifts.
Oh,
and then
okay.
the other one was, which of Core Action indicator did you think this lesson best exemplifies? So again, which behaviors from Core Action 3 did the students best exemplify in this lesson? What actions have you taken as a teacher to make that happen? You want to skip on
Yeah,
that
I
one?
feel like I already answered that, but I don't know the difference between the shifts and Core Action 3 if those are two separate questions.
Okay. Okay, so we'll move down the list here. Would you like to comment on any of the submitted students' work? Was there something that delighted or surprised you with their work yesterday? Did they submit any?
Well, they're going to be submitting like it today because we have a follow-up today. So I would say in the actual lesson itself, some things that really surprised me was a student's ability to look at the piece of art, the painting that I showed, and be able to kind of pull some higher level details from it in order to connect it to what we were currently studying. We haven't done a lot, being kind of early in the year, where we've done a lot of like art analysis, and that's typically something challenging for the students to do, but I felt like in their groups they were really motivated and excited by the piece, and you could almost see like the light bulbs going off when they would look at something and felt like, oh, I see how this relates, and I kind of on the spot gave them a challenge question. how does, this painting compare to the message in E.E. Cummings' poem, like what's similar or different? And I kind of just thought of that like in the moment and thought it might be a good question, since we're looking at differing authors' viewpoints and things like that, if the kids would be able to do that. And a lot of them were able to kind of, think through that and come up with a very, a good response that, showed thinking and showed that they were kind of internalizing even early on in the unit some of these bigger, essential understandings and the concept of the conflict between young and old and how it relates to acceptance.
Okay, so the last set of questions. Great instructors are continuously learning. We want to understand what you celebrated in this lesson and what you would improve upon. Reflecting on the lesson, what worked particularly well and what might you do differently?
I feel like the pairing of the text, like having so much in there, at first it felt like, oh, is this too much to have them going back to these different poems like we read, last week, and then also comparing it to this, would it be too much? But I felt like the students were able to sort of handle that like effortlessly, like that wasn't a challenging piece for them. So I was happy to see their ability to kind of keep all of that in their mind and see how it fits together and pieces together. I would say maybe a challenge for me a little bit was like the pacing. I would have liked to have been able to have a little bit more time at the very end for a whole class discussion. I do feel like I went around and was able to check in with every group and on that smaller level be able to talk through and see where everyone was at. But I would have liked that cohesion a little bit more, just maybe, 4 or 5 more minutes at the end, like when the students were saying how they connected like our anchor text to what we had been talking about, or the real world connection really hitting home a little bit with that. I also have a lot of adults that come into my classroom due to the high needs of my students. It's hard sometimes in the day to find time to communicate with those other educators our goals and our purposes. So a lot of that has to happen on the spot in the classroom. So I think with most of the people in my room, I felt like I was able to check in with. I have one support teacher that comes midway through the period, and I always have to remember, oh, she didn't see all of the instructions of what I'm asking the kids to do. So I sometimes need to check in with her sooner, like right when she walks in the door, because that was the group that I went to, and I was like, oh, I need to make sure they're annotating, and I didn't really give her the clear intent of at that moment, like here's what I want to do. So just remembering to check in so all of my kids are headed in the right direction and don't get frustrated if I have to ask them to do something and they were unclear on instructions.
Okay. Last question. Were there any surprises or unexpected student behaviors or reactions?
I think with my particular class, the group of students that I have, it's always kind of unexpected. I mean, you never really know when you have students that sometimes, they have trouble working in group settings. We have students that, get social work for being able to talk and work with group members. So it's always a little bit of that balancing act. I have some students that just always want to work on their own independently and maybe don't always see the value in working together as a group. I feel like for the most part, people were doing really well yesterday. There were some moments when, like I mentioned, when a couple of my students needed like a break to leave the classroom, or just needed a little more reassurance in the moment because they were feeling frustrated. When you're using a very hard text, it's important to let the kids know that it's okay to struggle. Not in this lesson, but in previous lessons throughout the year. Like I've had, some students almost have like a meltdown at first, like, oh my gosh, I don't understand this. And I think just that reassurance and letting students know that everybody struggles You know, just because I'm a teacher doesn't mean everything I read I understand perfectly. You know, I've come across things I don't get to, and that's nothing wrong with me. You're not a bad reader. You're not, you know, not intelligent or anything like that. You just have to put forth that effort and figure out what you need to do to get to that comprehension. Okay. Oh my gosh, that was horrible. I hate that.
No, you
I
did
hate
great.
stuff like that.
That's
Thank you.
great information. I'm sorry I missed the class.